Welcome to another half hour of Point of View. I'm Pastor Josh Barnes, and this is the show where we're unashamed to look at political, social, cultural, and theological issues from a biblical worldview because Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, and he said the Bible's true. We can't be right about issues if we disagree with the Bible, and the Bible is true. So, here's our premise. Here's why this is so important, because you're definitely wrong if you disagree with the Bible. So let's make sure that whatever it is that we believe, we're being biblical about it. So let's talk about our issue for today, and that is racism. Racism and critical race theory, actually, is our subject for today and tomorrow. And you might say that you know what the Bible says about this subject. The Bible is against racism. And of course, you would be right if you said that. Yes, of course the Bible is against racism. But how does that translate to today? Is critical race theory something that churches should adopt, a teaching and an understanding of the world that churches should adopt because it's anti-racism? Or is it actually racist? Is it really helping or making things worse? These are questions that I wanted to ask to a group of men at the NRB conference just this last week. NRB is a Christian media conference in Nashville, Tennessee this year. And I sat down with Neil Mammen, Pastor Stephen Broden, and Kevin McGary, and asked these questions. What is CRT? Now, these are three men of color, black men, minority, whatever you want to call them. I just say they're men who have darker shade of skin than me, and they do have a different cultural experience. But they are able to speak to this issue in a way that I cannot. And so for that reason, I say, hey, why don't we get all three of them together and have them comment on this subject in a way that I just can't, on a level that I can't speak to. And so we did. I loved having them. They seemed to enjoy being there as well. I loved it. It was an amazing discussion. I'm going to share half of that with you today because it went so long. We ended up going over 40 minutes long. We can't even show you in a half hour the entire thing. So I'm going to give you the first half now, and we'll do the second half tomorrow. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, this is all going to be one long video. So you'll see the whole giant thing. But if you're watching on FISM TV or some other means, you may be watching it where it's split in two because we have those half-hour time constraints. So without further ado, here is my panel discussion on critical race theory at NRB. I'm Josh Barnes, and we're back here at NRB. Thanks for joining us. This is the NRB, the Christian Media Convention, here in Nashville, Tennessee this year. And I'm joined with a panel of experts. We want to ask the question, what is CRT? What's wrong with it? Is it wrong? And we want to look at this from a biblical worldview, from a Christian perspective. And this is something that is not just being taught to government employees, but is also something now that's being pushed in schools, being taught to our children. So we want to not only say what it is and what's wrong with it, but we want to use biblical a thought process to look at it and say here's why it's wrong. So I brought the experts. I'm not the one with all the answers. These are the guys with the answers. Here's my experts. Make sure I get everything right. We have Pastor Stephen Broden, who is the executive director of the Content of Character series and also pastor of
the Fair Park Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas.
Fair Park Bible Fellowship. And then we've got the co-founders of Every Black Lives Matter. You can see that right there on their shirt. And that's Kevin McGary there all the way on the left.
Hello.
And Neil Mammen, who we've met up before at CPAC. And Pastor Broden, you've been on Point of View, my show, as well, almost a year ago now. So it's so good to have you guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Awesome.
Now let's start. Let's jump right into the issue. And if I can start with you, Pastor, what is CRT and what is wrong with it?
Well, I think the place to start is understanding that CRT is a part of a Marxist toolkit that was birthed out of cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism was that which was created by Antonio Gramsci out of the Frankfurt School of Germany back in the 1920s. where he was puzzled by the 1917 Bolshevik revolution that took place in Russia. And they were puzzled that it did not catch in Western Europe. And so he began to investigate that, and he came to the conclusion that the reason why it didn't catch in Western Europe was because of Christianity, and that Christianity's influence on all of the institutions that influenced Western Europe at that time were responsible for those to whom they were desiring that the revolution to take place with were not willing to take place in that revolution. And so he sat back and he studied that, and he said, well, classical Marxism will not work. So we must come up with something different. And they came up with what is called cultural Marxism, which takes the emphasis off of the economics or the economy and puts it on the culture. And he says if we can change the culture, kill off Christianity and change the culture through infiltration and gradualism, we can flip the West. And so what we see is that CRT, which was birthed out of critical race theory, is a part of a series of tools within their kit designed to flip America. So what we have in that toolkit is critical theory, critical race theory, we have intersectionality, we have liberation theology, we have social justice, and cancel culture, all designed to do one thing, to flip this nation by creating chaos. And out of chaos comes a new order for them. So when we look at CRT, you've got to look at it as a toolkit, a tool in the kit of the Marxists to flip this nation.
Wow. So if I'm understanding you correctly, now what you're saying is cultural Marxism as opposed to economic Marxism says with the Marxism you have taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Now cultural Marxism is going to demonize the majority in the culture and sort of say take from them.
Demonize Christianity. In order for them to be effective, they've got to remove Christianity from the public square. Take a look at what's happening in America. The influence of Christianity has been marginalized, even negated in some senses, and replaced with cultural Marxism, which is human secularism that's fueled by Darwinism, feminism, Marxism, communism, and secular humanism. And all those isms were created by men and women who hated God. And so when we look at what's happening in America, is that the cultural Marxists, which are political correctness, came to America as political correctness, is killing off Christianity and replacing it with human secularism.
Wow. I'm going to go over to you, Neil, and I want to get a little deeper. What are some of the specific things that are taught by Black Lives Matter? I'm sorry, not you have Every Black Life Matters. So let's, instead of getting into the organization let's go to CRT itself. Okay. What are some of the specific teachings of CRT that are really problematic?
Well, I mean, there's a few fundamental ones, but the biggest thing, and then Kevin will go into the unforgiveness part of it, but is that you have the hegemony aspect of it. You've got the conquerors and the conquered, you've got the oppressed and the oppressors, and you need to then balance this out and try to level the playing field. That's the equity and equality and all that. So what they do is CRT basically essentially says, if you're white, you're of the oppressor class. If you're not white, you're of the oppressed class. However, if you're Chinese or Jewish, then you're white adjacent, and then you're of the oppressor class too. And basically it says that if you're black, you have or of the oppressor class, you have a higher moral standing than anyone who's of the oppressor class. Sorry. The oppressor class has a lower moral standing than anyone of the oppressed class. So if you're black, you have a higher moral standing. It doesn't matter what the truth is, that your morality is higher than a white's morality. And as a result of that, what happens is you get this, well, all white people are racist, or all white people are part of the racist structure. All white people are enabling the racism of America, right? And the reality is Americans are not, in fact, I've traveled all over the world. Some as you know, I mentioned I grew up in Ghana. I was born in Ghana, grew up in Africa. My parents are Indian origin. I've traveled all the world as an engineer. I can tell you, America is the least racist country I've ever lived in. That might be one or two others out there, like Canada maybe or something, but America is the least racist country. India is certainly not not racist. I mean, it's a very racist country. It's got this caste system. You know, in India, if you're dark, you're considered unattractive. If you're black, the first question Indian grandmothers ask about their grandkids is, how fair is he? Meaning, how white is he?
Wow.
You know, and we think that comes from the Aryan influence, because the Aryans came in and conquered the north, and the darker South Indians were the lesser class, and they're the lower caste level. So I've seen that all over. But in America, I've seen the least amount of racism, and it's actually exemplified if you look at the median salaries. In America, the highest salaries or medium salary income is made by Indians or brown. The next highest are by the Taiwanese. And then when you go down a few levels, before you even see any European ethnicities, you actually see Nigerians and Ghanaians.
Wow.
So it's not a color thing here, right? There's a cultural plight that we see, and Kevin can talk about that. But a lot of CRT basically says, you are evil because you're white. And then they have this intersectionality that Pastor talked about. What happens if you are black, but somebody else is transgender? Well, then you have a higher moral standing. Mm-hmm. So the more afflictions you can add to yourself, or whatever, the more suppressions that you have experienced, the higher. So if you're gay, black, and maybe have a disease or something, then you have a higher moral standing. And that's what they call intersectionality.
Yeah, now, so that brings up another question. But before I'm trying to order all my questions here, because there's so much to say, and you guys are able to come at it from an expertise and a perspective that I can't. So I'm going to ask a question to all three of you here, but we'll start with you, Kevin, if you would. Is it, in your experience, have you experienced racism in America? And if so, in your experience, do you think it is the majority of white people in America that are racist? Do you think that there's any truth to that?
So me personally, excuse me, I haven't experienced racism that I could recall. I may have, but by God's grace, it kind of goes over my head. I don't really see it, or I haven't experienced it that way. Mm-hmm. That's not to say it doesn't exist. Racism, I believe, exists. It certainly exists in pockets. I have a number of family members and friends who have experienced it in various parts when they travel the country. They're treated differently, grossly differently, and for them it's traumatic. So it does exist. Is it systemic? That's a whole nother conversation. I know we can have a conversation about that, but I don't believe America is a systemically racist country to that degree.
You would think that if it was systemic, you would have experienced it at some point. And
absolutely, but I do believe that we have some systemic institutions that are systemically racist. It's a different conversation. It's not America, but there are there's a couple of institutions that actually fit the systemic definition of racism.
While that's on your mind, would you name an institution that you
Sure.
think
So first and foremost, there was an institution that was around in the 1800s. That particular institution was led by white, supremacist, hateful, racist people. That particular faction of people made sure to enslave as many blacks as they could. And that particular institution made sure that people that shared their faction of mindset were over courts, and they were judges and legislators. And so when we had Dred Scott, when we had Jim Crow, when we had black codes and those things that would have made a difference and ended slavery early, that particular faction of people made sure that they would keep blacks under the thumb and keep them enslaved. That particular faction, when Abraham Lincoln passed Emancipation Proclamation, hated that, and Abraham Lincoln was then, of course, he was then assassinated. His vice president was of this particular faction, and his vice president said, "Look, even though Abraham Lincoln signed off on 40 acres and a mule, we're going to take that off the table because blacks don't deserve it." That particular faction of people, when we had the Homestead Act, they made sure that they had their overseers over the Homestead Act. Homestead Act, of course, would provide lands and parcels. So when blacks were set free, they would have the ability to till the land and make a way for themselves. But that particular faction oversaw the Homestead Act and made sure that all of the people that oversaw the Homestead Act gave parcels of land to newly immigrated Europeans and not the blacks that it should have gone through during Reconstruction. So that particular faction, then when we had during Reconstruction, they wanted to make sure to defile blacks as much as possible and make it as difficult as possible. So they basically instituted the KKK to try to keep blacks in line. Then when they heard of eugenics, when eugenics came about, that particular faction came on board. That particular faction is white supremacist, racist, and all of the disparaging things that we can talk about today. To this day, they're in favor of eugenics, and that particular faction just happens to be still around. So when they talk about reparations, reparations is always for, you get reparations from the parties that actually did the harms. And I say, since this particular faction is the one that did the harms, when we talk about reparations, and they're so hair on fire about it, great. Give us the reparations. You're the ones who actually did this. There was a faction in America in the 1800s that precipitated this. Systemically racist by definition, and that particular faction should pay if we're going to go down that line. Now, the other one would be critical race theory itself is systemically racist. The reason why, the actual definition for systemic is everybody within a system, everybody in a system, up, down, in, out, through and through, has a particular ideology. And so a systemically racist organization like that faction I talked about, and CRT is majority, everybody in it has this thing. Critical race theory, bottom line is, we're going to make sure to hold all whites accountable for all harms that were done in the 1800s. So if you just lack the amount of melanin that I have, you're going to be held fully responsible, past, present, and your future. Your children and great-grandchildren are going to be held accountable for that. You're going to be canceled. You're going to be, you're irredeemable. So that's what CRT teaches. All of the academics, everybody that embraces CRT, embrace that ideology, and it's self-perpetuated within the system. So CRT meets the definition of systemic racism. It actually fits. So we got the faction that is hair on fire and all about, all white supremacy. That particular faction that did that in the 1800s is still around today. And the people that purport CRT and Planned Parenthood,
Would you
which
name
I didn't
the
even get
faction
to.
for our audience, just in case there's confusion?
Well, okay. So Neil and I purposely don't name that particular faction because once we do, it gives the other side, see, you're political. Oh, forget it.
I see.
Everything I would have said is then nullified because I've made a political statement.
We'll have it blinking on the bottom of the screen.
I'll say it. I'll tell you, when he's talking about the Democratic Party, who has been responsible for the Jim Crow laws, for KKK, and for fighting against civil rights. And it took the Republican Party with some arm twisting on the part of President Johnson to get a few Democrats to come over for the civil rights legislation to pass. It was primarily a Republican bill, but history doesn't record that. And so I don't mind saying it because I don't have to worry about that because the truth of the matter is that I have experienced personally racism. I experienced it, and as a black person in the black community, I experience it every time a Democrat shows up to lie to me about who I need to vote for. That's racism.
Yeah.
And so it is alive and well. And of course, growing up as a young man in the 60s, we saw it when there was a lot of movement in terms of civil rights legislation and Martin Luther King and what have you. There was a lot of resistance to that, and it came from the racists.
And Pastor, I was going to ask you, as we're talking about racist organizations, we were talking even before we started the interview about another one, which would be, Planned Parenthood, and the abortion industry really started. You being a pastor, I'm sure you've interacted with that issue and that problem. Can you talk a little bit on that?
Oh, absolutely. Margaret Sanger, who is the mother of the abortion industry in America, said that Negroes are like weeds. We need to get rid of them. She specifically targeted the African American community, and her position was that we're useless, we don't make any contribution, and that we hold back the progression of the human race because we're a drag on it. She basically took the Malthusian view of of the value of human beings based upon their contributions economically. And in America, the slaves came out of that slavery and did not have access to the economy, nor the freedoms that would allow them to develop economic systems within their own communities. She said, we're worthless and we need to get rid of them. And so the target of Planned Parenthood has been and continue to be the African American community, where over 80% of all abortion facilities are located within walking distance of a black community. That's not by accident, that's by design. And so we are resisting that. And Kevin and I and others have been working. I'm one of the founders, and Johnny Hunter and myself started a group called the National Black Pro-Life Coalition, where we have pulled together all the coalitions of black pro-lifers together to champion the cause of communicating our message into our community. We do that through three things: information, education, and activation. Information asks and answers the question, what's going on? A lot of us are oblivious to what's going on. And so there's a need, a desperate need for us to communicate to them the intent and the purpose of abortion, particularly in our community. Education asks and answers the question, why is this happening and how is it happening? The deliberate targeting on the part of this institution in our culture and in our world is to depopulate, and they're starting with us. And then activation comes out of information and education. There is no activation unless you know what's going on and why it's going on, and then we can push back effectively against it. So that's what we're attempting to do through the National Black Pro-Life Coalition, to educate and inform and to cause the community to stand up and push back against this effort. We believe abortion can end in America if it goes through the black community, because we're the ones who are most victimized by it. The number one killer of black people in America is abortion.
Yeah. So, and to the question that I was posing to everyone, have you experienced racism in America, and would you say that it is the majority of or even as CRT would claim, all white people that are racist?
I think it's wrong to say that all white people are racist, but it is right to say are white people racist? Yeah, a few of them are. Are black people? Yes. Asian, and so forth and so on. It is a sin problem.
Yeah.
It is a problem that does not recognize Acts chapter 26, that God made all humankind through one blood, and we're not races that are divided. We are the human race.
One race, yeah.
And that happens through, I think, that kind of information happens through solid Bible preaching and teaching. That has not happened across the pulpits as it should. And so, yes, I have experienced it as a young man, and so I do know that it does exist. But is it typical of America? No. I think America has corrected a lot of that problem, and the correction for it has been our Constitution and the concepts that are found in our Declaration of Independence that clearly states that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. We are men, black men and white men and Asian men and brown men, and we're all created equal in the sight of God. Amen. But everybody doesn't have a biblical worldview. There is a group out there that does not consider the biblical worldview, and they're susceptible to the enticements and the allurements of the dark side, of the satanic side, and they're living inside of that. So racism does exist, and we would be foolish not to believe that it doesn't exist here in America. It does, and there's a biblical answer for it.
Now, this has some people scratching their heads. I think some people think about racism, and they say, this is wrong, this is against the scriptures, as you laid out very clearly. And so they think of CRT as a solution, and they say, CRT must be good, and therefore biblical and Christian. Can you, Neil, I'm going to pose this one to you. What would you say to someone who says, boy, it's the Christian thing to do to fight racism, so we should be for CRT?
Well, there's the Christian thing to do, which is to fight racism, absolutely. The civil rights movement and everything was all pushed by Christians, right? It was started by Christians, it was dreamt up by Christians, and it was fought by Christians. But there's a difference between CRT and anti-racism, right? Or fighting racism. So I think it's quite simple, as we've seen. The roots of CRT is Marxism. I was actually brought up in a Marxist family. My father was a communist and an atheist. My uncles were leaders in the Marxist movement in India. My father became a Christian when I was about 5, so my home life was Christian, but the extended family was all Marxist. And this is an anti-God movement. It turns out that while there are Christians who are Marxists, most Marxists are very much against God. So you can't say it's a Christian thing when it was actually introduced by the most anti-Christian group of people ever, right? So no, there's no way you can tie it together. And then CRT Olson, I think I'm going to toss this over to Kevin. CRT misses a key issue about Christianity, which is forgiveness. And I'll let Kevin take that one.
And so here's the deal. What the underpinnings of critical race theory, social justice, and liberation theology, black liberation theology, is forgiveness. Think about this. I want everybody to think about this. If we actually embraced forgiveness, CRT wouldn't exist. It goes away. Because remember, CRT is saying, look, I will not forgive you. You're irredeemable. You're white. You're racist. Not only you, but past generations and your future generations. All whites, period. Hard stop. End of story. You're oppressors, victimizers. You need to be canceled. That's what CRT says today. That's what it says. So if we actually were forgivers, it would have no power. It would go away. Black liberation theology generally, is the same thing. James Cone and all of his writings wouldn't exist if there was a heart of forgiveness. It just wouldn't exist. He wouldn't have written anything, right? So here's the thing. Here's the existential threat to every Christian listening to this broadcast. The existential threat, and I would encourage you to please do your research right now. Mark 11:25 and 26 says, if you do not forgive, your Father in heaven will not, and it's unequivocal, will not forgive you. All right. Matthew 6. Jesus has given his disciples how to pray, the Lord's Prayer. Matthew 6:9 through 15. 9 through 13, he goes through the Lord's Prayer. In the Lord's Prayer, as we all remember, it says, and forgive us as we forgive. It's always connected and conditional, okay? Now, when Jesus finished the Lord's Prayer, he goes to 14 to 15. You look at 14 and 15. Essentially what Jesus says to the disciples, yeah, okay, that was the Lord's Prayer, but here, disciples, I'm letting you brothers know, look, if you will not forgive, your Father in heaven is not going to forgive you. This is consistent. It's throughout the scriptures. So we have a lot of Christians today following culture and being led by these demonic philosophies, and they don't even know. Right now, they're lost. Because think about it. If God has not forgiven us, where do we go? I mean, that's the existential question, right? If we're not being forgiven, what happens to us, right? So this is a really, really critical moment, and it's a critical moment for the church. We all need to understand this.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was going to go to you next, right, Pastor, because liberation theology, would you agree with this, that it seems to be opposite of the gospel, where liberation theology kind of takes the scriptures and looks at the whole thing in the lens of liberating oppressed people from their oppressors. But much of the scripture is actually written by kings and people in authority. And in fact, the scripture, Jesus came not because the publicans and sinners were oppressed, but rather because they were physically, but because they were oppressed by sin, and they were in slavery and bondage to sin. And it seems like when we talk about liberation theology, what gets completely taken out of the Bible is salvation from sin. And the gospel itself. Have you encountered this liberation theology in your ministry, and what do you think about it? What do you think the Bible has to say about it?
Well, liberation theology and black liberation theology is still out there, but it doesn't have the strong foothold in the community. I want us to what Kevin and Neil has done is they've gone into CRT, and they recognize some of the components of it is anti-God and anti-Christ. Same thing is true with liberation theology. But my view of it is a 30,000-foot view. And so I want to remind our listeners that we must keep that view in mind, that it's all those tools instruments that are being used by the Marxists are designed for one purpose: to undermine what we have, to destroy our Constitution, and to destroy our religious liberty. That's the view I want us to keep in mind. That if we go back up and look at it, then we see what it is. But if we dive down into it, we can get lost in the details and forget that it is an instrument designed to cause chaos and confusion. So out of chaos comes a new world order.
Yes.
And that's what they're attempting to do. So CRT is just one more instrument to cause confusion and division. And that's precisely what is happening. Kevin said it best. It is a deception. And the Bible warns us about this deception. It says in Colossians chapter 2 and 8, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophies, Marxism, empty deceptions, the lies of Marxism, and traditions of men and the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Jesus Christ. The answer to all of those things is a right connection to God through Christ. And seeing as he sees, knowing as he has made known, and doing what God called us to do. That's not happening in the church.
Amen.
And that's what we're standing up and calling the church back to, looking at this from a 30,000-foot view and recognizing what is happening in America is not incidental or accidental. It's by design. It is cultural Marxism that is called political correctness that has muted the voice of the church because they're too busy trying to play political correctness and bowing the knee to tolerance of every kind and sort that is even antithetical to our very faith. But now, let me stop here and say this. The church is divided in two ways. There's the cultural church, and then there's the biblical church. The biblical church believes in the inerrancy and the infallibility and the inspiration of scriptures, and they're listening to God. The cultural church is bowing down to political correctness. And that's the problem in America today.
Yeah. So, and we'll go one at a time here. What do you think is the answer? How do we get this to people so that people understand how dangerous this is, and how do we defeat CRT?
You want to start with me? Or
yeah, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay. Well, I think the answer is found in having a right connection with Jesus Christ. That the starting point for filtering the world, looking at the world through the filter of our faith, gives us the answers to what we need to do. There is a need, a screaming need, a desperate need for us to get connected back to our faith and develop a divine perspective. When we say perspective, we mean the faculty of seeing all the relevant data in a meaningful relationship. That can only happen when we're rightly connected to God. When we see as he sees, know as he has made known, and do what he calls us to do, we can correct this mess. And until that happens, I think we're in trouble. The other thing that we can do is to be connected with our founding principles. I think that's the answer too. Mark Levin said in his book, Liberty and Tyranny, in his introduction, he said this: the remedy to tyranny is conservatism, precisely because its principles are the founding principles. Well, what are those principles? There are 10 of them. Liberty, equality, the rule of law, consent of the governed, natural rights, private property, self-government, constitutionalism, and independence. I think I named all 10 of them.
Sounds right.
That's the answer.
That's great. Now, Neil, same question to you. Okay. What is the answer here?
So, everything that Pastor said is absolutely 100%. I would add one more thing. I think the solution here, if we care to do so, is for the churches to be teaching everybody about this. I wrote a book called Jesus is Involved in Politics. It's called, in fact, the title is Jesus is Involved in Politics. Why aren't you? Why isn't your church? And I think that's the greatest shortcoming that we have. See, pastors need to be out there teaching about this. Pastors need to be educating the flock. You see, in the old days, the most learned man in the village was the pastor, right? He knew everything. He had a science degree. He had a philosophy degree. He was the guy who knew everything. Today, our pastors are abdicating that responsibility. And even though all the studies, I think Barna did a study where everybody wanted to learn about these political issues, wanted to be informed about this, but the pastors said, we're not going to do it. And I think that's where the problem is. The pastors need to be involved. And this is really critical, because if you look at the history of Christianity, Right? I had a pastor come and say, well, I don't think we should be involved in politics. I said, well, in that case, you think child prostitution is okay? He said, no, I don't think so. I said, absolutely, you do. In fact, you think gladiatorial combat is okay. He said, no, I don't. He said, well, you also think slavery is okay. He said, I did not. I said, yes, that's exactly what you're saying. You see, because slavery, child prostitution, temple prostitution, child abandonment, elder abandonment, the gladiatorial combat, death games, and you can go down the line. Every single one of those laws were changed because Christians got involved in politics. How heartless, wicked, and cruel can you be to say we should not be involved in politics? It's only because, and not only just people, but pastors, like take the slavery issue in England. William Wilberforce fought that, but who was behind William Wilberforce? John Newton. His pastor and his entire church. That was the center where they met. John Newton was the guy who says, no, William, you've got to go out and fight this battle. When he got tired, he said, no, you got to fight this battle. You got to go out there. There was a pastor behind him. And I asked pastors, will you be the William Wilberforce? Will you be the John Newton to William Wilberforce? Are you going to get out there and say, this is the problem with America. This is where America is going. Will you be the person to train America? Because we have something like 60 million evangelicals in America, and only 20 million of them are voting.
Wow. That's stepping on my toes as a pastor, but it's what we need to hear. I love that. Same question over here, Kevin.
So one of the biggest issues I think that we're facing, I just wrote an article about it. It's not published yet, but it'll be published in the next few days, is the reason why we're seeing CRT, the deconstruction movement, and all of these other theories and philosophies really taking wind and actually catching wind within the church is because we have a lack of discipleship. So we've done a great job, I think, or a really good job at gathering people, at evangelizing. Evangelizing is a part of it. That's fine. But when we make that our church's mission, our fundamental mission, then we've abdicated our responsibility, our mandate that Jesus gave us, Matthew 28, go and make disciples. Jesus also gathered 3,000, 5,000, he gathered. But he had 12 disciples that he really committed his life to. And those 12 are the ones who changed the world. Those 11 are the ones who changed the world. So when we don't make disciples, when we gather and birth people into the kingdom and then leave them at the curb, then who's going to influence them? Whoever the next passerby is. That would be culture. That would be those people in secular society. And they're going to be smitten by the compelling, seducing ways of the world, as opposed to being fully discipled into the life of Jesus. Jesus gave us the pattern of discipleship, sharing lives together relationally, and becoming like Jesus. That's the only thing. And we would not be seduced by all these, races and everything else, if we actually committed ourselves to the thing that Jesus commanded us to do. But we've abdicated that responsibility. So now we're swept and gripped by society and secular culture and everything else. So that's the difference. That's the solution in my mind. Number two is we have to repent and forgive. We can't even begin to reconcile. Reconciliation comes through Christ. Okay. We could say, hey, I got a great idea for reconciliation. Why don't you shine my shoes? Why don't you tell me you love me? And do all of these things that were popular with Promise Keepers. That was fine. Those were tactical solutions. They weren't strategic, as we can see now. Most of those brothers are separated and not speaking to each other because they're different races. So here's the issue. We have to forgive one another. We have to forgive ourselves, forgive each other. Now, I'm speaking right now of forgiveness as it relates to race, but forgiveness is an issue that we all face. Ex-spouses, ex-employers. The command to forgive is constitutive in every domain. So, we're not going to be able to be fully reconciled one to another until we come to the point where we have a heart that forgives, a spirit that forgives, and that would allow us to truly love our brothers again. Okay, so that kind of reconciliation and unity can only be found in forgiveness and with some very specific discipleship one to another.
Wow, and now all of you are in this work. You're not just giving, conceptual things that can help change America and help fix this problem, but you're actively working. Tell people how they can get in touch and be a part of what you're doing. Let's start here with Black. Every Black Life Matters.
Every Black Life Matters. You can go to our website, please. Everyblm.com. Everyblm.com. We have tons of resources out there. Lots of interviews, podcasts, articles all over. Lots of resources for even if you want to maintain your body, the autonomy, and not have to be under a government mandate for vaccines and that. We have resources. If you go to our resources column, we have resources under COVID with exemption letters, resources for ivermectin, whatever. So that kind of stuff is there for you. As well as if you wanted to be a CRT activist, you can go there and we have letters already pre-written that you can just fill in your name and send to your city councils, send to your school boards, and become overnight an anti-CRT activist. So those types of resources are there, and we have a partner site as well. And any of your prayers and support would be helpful. Everyblm.com is where you can find us.
That's great. And anything else you wanted to add to that? Great.
Oh yeah, well we do. Yeah.
Where can people get the T-shirts?
Oh well, if you're at the show, you could have gotten one. I think we're all out now. But you can definitely go to our website. You can purchase them there. But the other thing is that we want to add is that we actually do a training. So if you have a church or a group of people, we'll come in and we'll do a one-day workshop teaching you all about CRT. What's the difference between social justice and true justice? We'll teach you, things that kind of allow you to explain it to others and put it all in perspective, and also allow you to know how to argue these things. So we do a one-day workshop.
So you're providing that resource that you've just explained is desperately needed by churches.
Yeah. So if a pastor doesn't want to touch these topics, fine. We'll be the bad guys. Yeah. We don't mind.
Yeah.
Bring us in.
And Pastor Broden, would you explain a little bit about your work in this area and what people can do?
Well, Content of Character series, we do educational summits. We come into a city or a church and do a one-day seminar where we talk about the kinds of things that we've been talking about here and try to inform and educate as many of our Christian brothers and sisters as to the authenticity of the threat that we're facing and what they can do about it. So they can get in contact with us through our website, contentofcharacterseries.com, contentofcharacterseries.com, or there's a splash page that we have created that has a number of organizations that are doing work to push back against this tyranny that is happening in our country at bravesalt.com. That's Brave Salt, B-R-A-V-E, salt, not pepper.com. And that's how they can get in contact with us. You get in contact with us, and we can come to your city or to your church and do a one-day summit, educational summit on the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today.
That's so great, guys. Thank you all for joining us here on Right America Media. This is, I think, so helpful. I know. Speaking from my perspective and from my life view, as a white person, I get very resentful when I hear about CRT because I'm being called racist, and I don't feel like I am.
And you're not.
And yeah, I've that's not who I am.
I mean, racism is an active thing. But I might be ignorantly racist, but most racism is an active thing.
Sure.
But the other thing is this: when you get upset and angry like that, they're achieving their purpose.
Right. Yeah.
They're dividing us.
And that's one of the things that I think that I've personally learned just having this conversation with you, that there's more than just my own personal offense at CRT. There are deep-seated problems and goals that they're trying to accomplish with this that we need to be aware of.
Yes.
And we need to fight against it at every corner, every turn. I know in my own town there's little sneaky ways that they're trying to get it into the school system.
Right.
And real quick before I go, anyone who wants to take the question, what are your thoughts on them putting this into schools? What's trying to be accomplished there, and what are some things we can fight against? Ways we can fight against.
Well, let me do a quick one. When the Frankfurt School first came to America from Germany, they were basically escaping from Hitler, a different type of socialist. Hitler only liked his own kind of socialism. When they came here, they realized one of the problems, the biggest problem, is the church. Well, how do they get into the American spirit? They've got to get in through the schools. So you'll see they have been infiltrating the schools right from the beginning, slowly and expanding that influence. And so this is just part of that process of infiltrating schools. And the way to stop it is the parents have to take back the school board. They've got to get back in there, and they've got to kill this.
Most Marxists and socialists recognize the best way to advance their cause is to get control of the children and to indoctrinate them. And that's precisely what is happening in America through these Luciferian institutions of indoctrination called public schools.
Yes.
They control it, and they are developing the curriculum, and they are influencing our kids to be little Marxists, little socialists, and they're winning today if we don't hurry up and stop them.
Yeah. And Kevin, anything else you want to add on that thought there?
No, I think that these gentlemen, they handled that.
I love the word Luciferian. I'm going to use that if you don't mind.
Yes, I didn't originate it, but it's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
That's great. Kevin,
Yes, sir.
Neil, Pastor Stephan, thank you so much for joining us on Right America. We'll have to have you
Thank
get
you.
back sometime
Have
soon.
us again.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
By the way, all of those guys so much appreciate them coming on the show. And not only were they all just incredibly deep and intelligent and had thought through this issue, but also they all had different personalities and different perspectives that they brought to the table. It was, I think, the perfect panel discussion. Honestly, when we do panel discussions and things, usually you get everybody saying the same thing, and but these guys had individual perspectives and individual things to say that all added to this one story. And my goodness, it was so great. It was just great. Thank you so much to the guys for coming on. And we'll have to have each of them back on sometime. But now I want you now to think about what was said here. Think about what conclusions were brought. This is not just a white person saying, no, not all white people are racist, which is, it's silly, that white people can't defend themselves because we're all racist. So we've just been excluded from defending ourselves, right? But this is actual, black men in America, in the South even. Pastor Stephan Broden, he lives in the South. And he says, yes, I have experienced racism, but it's not the majority of people in America who've been racist. There's pockets of that. We need to fight against that. But we do not need to bring in cultural Marxism into our society and destroy America in the name of racism. And that's all it is. It's just another crisis by which the left is trying to destroy America as founded. And that's not good. It's not good for Christians. It's not good for anyone. So as Christians, we should stand against it. Again, thanks everybody for joining today. Don't forget to go on to whitemountainmunchies.com and use the promo code RAM at checkout to help promote the show and to get an amazing discount on some amazing snack food. That's all the time we have. We'll see you next time on Point of View.